I never imagined that courage could sound like screaming. That day, it did. My daughter's scream tore through Maplewood Park like glass under pressure. I remember the sun, golden and soft, cutting across the playground slides. Sophie was laughing, her braces catching the light, small silver rings hugging her legs like armor. She called them her super legs. She'd just climbed her first set of monkey bars without help. The other kids clapped, then Deborah Langford appeared. The HOA president, the woman who measured worth in inches of trimmed grass and shades of beige paint. Her voice cracked the air. "This is private property. Those metal contraptions are not allowed here." Before I could reach them, she lunged forward. Her hands gripped the metal braces and ripped. The sound, metal against skin, a child's cry, my own breath catching, wasn't something a parent forgets. Sophie fell into the sand, clutching her bare knees, her little hands trembling. I ran. Everyone froze except me. The world blurred into red and dust, and as I cradled my daughter in my arms, watching her tears fall onto the crushed sand, I whispered the only thing that would come out: "You have no idea who you just hurt." Because what Deborah didn't know was that my husband wasn't just another quiet suburban dad. He was a federal investigator, and the law she'd mocked for years was about to knock on her perfect white door. Before that day, our life in Maplewood felt almost idyllic. We'd chosen the neighborhood for its stillness, white fences, manicured lawns, cul-de-sacs where laughter echoed safely between mailboxes. Every morning, Sophie would stand by the window watching the world wake up. She loved seeing the school bus turn the corner, the sound of its brakes like a familiar heartbeat. Her silver braces gleamed in the morning sun, polished not for vanity but pride. They weren't signs of weakness. They were her wings. I worked from home as a landscape designer. My husband Michael left before sunrise. Federal fieldwork didn't allow him to talk much about what he did, but he carried the calm of a man who understood both rules and consequences. When he came home, he'd lift Sophie in his arms and say, "You know, kiddo, strength isn't about walking fast. It's about never stopping." Our neighbors mostly adored her. The Peterson kids played in our yard. The Garcias baked her cookies. Even the mailman left notes of encouragement on her drawings. But not everyone shared that kindness. Across the street lived Deborah Langford, the HOA president, a woman who treated our peaceful community like her private kingdom. Everything had to fit her vision: neutral shutters, identical mailboxes, no chalk drawings on sidewalks. She smiled like a politician, but her eyes never smiled with her. At first, it was small things. Notices in our mailbox. Emails about visual consistency. She called Sophie's leg braces reflective distractions in an HOA meeting, as if they were decorations, not lifelines. We laughed it off at dinner. "Let her file a complaint with God," Michael joked, but I should have known better, because in places like Maplewood, monsters don't roar. They whisper in the language of rules, and Deborah Langford had written them all. And soon, our calm little world was about to be tested by the ugliest form of control: cruelty disguised as order. It started on a Saturday so quiet you could hear the birds rehearsing their morning songs. The kind of day that feels too peaceful to hold anything cruel. Sophie was sitting on the porch, painting rocks for the garden path. Her silver braces caught the sunlight, small gleams of hope flashing against the green of the lawn. Every brushstroke she made was careful, precise, as if she wanted to leave beauty everywhere she went. Across the street, Deborah Langford was hosting another HOA inspection. Clipboard in hand, beige scarf around her neck, she moved from house to house like a self-appointed queen reviewing her kingdom. A man followed her with a camera, taking documentation photos for the board. When she reached our driveway, her gaze fixed on Sophie. At first I thought maybe she'd smile, maybe motherhood would stir something in her. But her face hardened. She crossed the street without asking, heels clicking like judgment itself. "Excuse me?" she snapped. "This equipment violates neighborhood standards." I blinked. "Equipment?" "The braces," she pointed, lips pursed. "They're metal. They shine. We've had complaints about glare and safety concerns." I stood between her and Sophie, my heartbeat rising. She needs those to walk. Deborah didn't even flinch. Needs or not, rules are rules. If it's visible, it affects property value. I'll issue a warning. Her voice was sharp, rehearsed, the tone of someone who's used to winning. She scribbled something on her clipboard, muttering about non-conforming accessories. Sophie tried to smile at her. "They're not accessories," she said softly. "They're my legs." That silence after. It was like the world stopped breathing. Deborah froze for half a second, her face twitching between embarrassment and rage. Then she turned and stormed off, her words slicing through the air. "Then make sure they stay inside." Neighbors watched from their porches, pretending not to. That night, a letter appeared in our mailbox, official HOA stationery. Gold seal at the top. Notice of non-compliance. Unauthorized medical equipment visible in common areas. Michael read it twice, jaw tightening. "They just crossed a federal line," he said quietly. I didn't know what he meant then, but he did. Because behind his calm eyes, something was already shifting. The part of him that didn't just love justice, he enforced it. That night, while Sophie slept in her small lavender-painted room, her braces leaned neatly by her bedside, Michael and I sat in the dim glow of the kitchen. The HOA notice lay flat on the table between us, next to his untouched cup of coffee. The clock ticked softly. The refrigerator hummed. The air felt heavier than it should. Michael spoke first. "I've seen this pattern before," he said, voice low and precise. "People like her, they don't stop with warnings. They escalate until someone breaks." He wasn't angry, not yet. His tone carried the kind of quiet a man learns from years of watching injustice repeat itself. In courtrooms, in police stations, in neighborhoods just like ours. I wanted to scream, to tear that letter apart, to march across the street and demand an apology. But I looked at Sophie's drawing on the fridge. A stick-figure family holding hands under the words, "We fix things." And I remembered who I married. A man who never rushed to anger, only to truth. So instead of shouting, he opened his laptop and began typing. Slowly, every click echoed like a chess move. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "Backing up evidence," he replied. "Every complaint, every letter, every HOA ruling she's ever signed. If she wants a war of rules, we'll win by her own book." I just sat there watching him work, his face illuminated by the cold light of justice beginning to form. Sophie stirred in her room, a small whimper, the sound of a child's body adjusting through pain. I walked to her door, resting my hand on the frame. She smiled in her sleep, and in that moment, something inside me shifted too. I realized silence isn't weakness. It's the sound you make when you're building your storm. The next morning, the neighborhood looked the same. But inside our house, something unseen had already changed. We weren't afraid anymore. We were waiting. Within a week, the whispers began. First, it was the looks. Curtains parting as we walked by, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Then came the messages, polite, practiced concern disguised as betrayal. "Hey, just a heads up. Debbie says the HOA might fine you." We love Sophie, of course, but maybe she shouldn't play outside as much right now. The neighborhood that once waved and smiled started to pull its shutters closed. Michael didn't react. He just kept collecting data. Every email, every voice message, every rule she twisted. The man I loved, the man who built dollhouses for Sophie on weekends, now moved like a quiet machine built for one purpose: truth. Then came the escalation. It was a Thursday afternoon when I found Sophie sitting at the edge of the yard, quietly crying. Her little purple notebook, the one she used to draw HOA badges for the friendly neighbors, was ripped in half. "Mommy," she whispered, "Mrs. Langford told me the neighborhood doesn't want me to walk around anymore. She said I'm distracting." I froze. Every muscle in me wanted to storm across the street. But Michael's voice echoed in my head. "Never interrupt arrogance." "Record it," so I did. The next morning, Sophie and I were in the driveway when Deborah returned, flanked by 2 HOA board members like bodyguards of bad taste. Clipboard in hand, voice dripping authority. Mrs. Miller, she began, we've received multiple complaints about unauthorized installations on your property. Installations? I asked. Those ramps, she said, pointing at the gentle wooden slope leading to our porch. They alter the aesthetic standard. They'll need to be removed. I laughed softly. That's an accessibility ramp for my daughter. It's an eyesore, she snapped. And your child's braces? Michael stepped out from the garage, calm, collected, the quiet before a tactical strike. Finish that sentence, he said. Deborah froze, startled by the sudden presence of someone who didn't bow. We're simply enforcing community standards, she managed. Understood, Michael said evenly. You'll want to make sure every word of what you're saying is compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Section 2132, the one that makes this conversation a federal issue. Her smugness faltered. She didn't understand yet, not fully, but a shadow of realization crossed her face. He smiled faintly, almost politely. Please proceed with your inspection. And he turned back into the house, closing the door gently behind him. That night, Deborah called an emergency HOA meeting. She wanted to address the growing non-compliance issue, but this time, Michael attended. And for the first time, the room that had always bowed to her went silent. Because while she brought her clipboard, he brought the law. And everyone in that hall was about to see what happens when arrogance meets authority, in its purest, most surgical form. That meeting changed everything. It was held in the Maplewood Community Hall, that pristine glass building where every HOA decision was, usually made behind the comfort of folded arms and forced smiles. Deborah sat at the head of the long oak table, flanked by her board. Carl, the treasurer who nodded at everything she said, and Denise, who recorded meetings as if they were episodes of her favorite drama. Michael and I sat quietly in the back row. Sophie stayed home with my sister. I remember her tiny voice when we left. Daddy, are you going to fix it? Always, he'd said. Deborah began with her usual performance, loud, confident, dripping with false righteousness. We're gathered today to discuss the non-compliance of the Millers' property. Multiple residents have expressed discomfort with visual clutter, namely, ramps and metallic medical devices visible from the street. She said it like she was announcing a war crime. I watched Michael's knuckles tighten slightly on the armrest, but his face stayed calm. Then Deborah leaned forward, her tone sharp as glass. We're issuing a fine, $200 per day until removal. That's when he stood up, slowly, deliberately. The room quieted. Before you file that fine, he said evenly, you might want to review the ADA Title II Federal Compliance Statutes and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Deborah blinked. Excuse me? Michael stepped closer to the table. His calmness carried a weight that turned the air heavy. What you're doing isn't just harassment. It's a civil rights violation, specifically discrimination against a disabled minor. That's a federal offense punishable by fines, lawsuits, and in some cases, prison. Carl shifted uncomfortably. Denise stopped recording. Who do you think you are? Deborah snapped. You can't threaten us. Michael's hand went into his jacket pocket. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move fast. He simply placed a small leather case on the table and flipped it open. Inside, a golden badge glinting under fluorescent light. Federal Department of Justice, Special Investigations Unit. The silence that followed could have swallowed the whole room. I don't make threats, he said quietly. I enforce federal law, and right now, this HOA is under investigation for discriminatory practices, misuse of funds, and abuse of authority. Deborah's face went pale. You can't. I can, he interrupted softly, and I already have. He tapped his phone once. A light blinked on the table. This meeting has been recorded for evidentiary purposes. Every statement you've made tonight is now part of an active federal record. You could feel the entire board begin to crumble in silence. No one dared move. He looked at each of them. Calm, professional, mercilessly polite. You'll receive your subpoenas by Monday. And with that, he turned to me and nodded. We're done here. As we walked out, Deborah called after us, voice shaking between fury and fear. "You think this is over? I run this neighborhood!" Michael paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. "Not anymore. Mrs. Langford, the law does." That was the night I saw who my husband truly was, not just a father protecting his child, but the quiet storm that ends tyranny with a single signature. After that meeting, the illusion of Maplewood's perfection cracked like a glass facade under pressure. The HOA board went quiet. No more flyers, no more complaints. But silence in their world didn't mean peace. It meant fear brewing in back rooms. Michael knew it too. For weeks, he moved with the precision of a man building a case brick by brick, his calm efficiency almost frightening in its focus. Our home office transformed into a quiet operations room. Folders lined neatly, timestamps labeled, voice recordings stored on encrypted drives. He had seen this pattern before. Small-time authoritarians hiding behind neighborhood charters to mask extortion and prejudice. And now he was going to dismantle it. Legally, surgically, and publicly, one night, I watched him print a document marked Federal Civil Rights Violation, Preliminary Findings. He spoke without looking up. "We're going to let her show the world exactly who she is. No warnings, no confrontations. Just cameras, signatures, and time." Then he called his contact at the state's compliance division. "This isn't just one woman," he said. "It's a system that thinks it can hide behind bylaws. I want full authorization for a coordinated audit. Records, finances, enforcement practices, all of it." A pause. Then the voice on the other end replied, "Approved. Do it clean, do it quiet." That week, unmarked sedans began showing up near Maplewood's entrance. Inspectors disguised as contractors reviewed HOA records, photographed meeting logs, traced funds. What they uncovered was worse than we imagined: misappropriated maintenance budgets, falsified citations, and a private slush fund used for personal property upgrades. At the center of every signature, Deborah Langford, Michael stayed patient. He didn't want her gone quietly. He wanted her exposed. He set the stage perfectly. When the HOA announced their annual Community Review Day, where Deborah gave her self-congratulatory speech on neighborhood order, Michael made sure every federal investigator would be there, posing as local residents. Every microphone recording, every camera rolling. And on the morning of the event, I saw it in his eyes. The stillness before the strike. "After today," he said, buttoning his coat, "no one will ever use a rule book to humiliate a child again." He wasn't going there for vengeance. He was going there to make an example, one the whole country would remember. The community green smelled of cut grass and hot coffee the morning Deborah took the stage. She arrived in that practiced armor of hers, beige blazer, perfectly coiffed hair, a smile that had been ironed and starched until it hurt to look at it. The folding chairs were almost full. The elderly brought their cushions, the retirees brought their polite applause, and the local camera crew brought a tripod that hummed quietly like an electric heartbeat. Michael and I sat near the back, hands linked, Sophie between us on a folding chair clutching a paper cup of juice. She wore her small silver braces wrapped in colorful socks, the ones the kids had gifted her last month, bright as flags. She didn't know what was coming, and that was how it should be. Deborah spoke about standards and community safety. Applause punctuated the familiar lines. She reached for the predictable anecdotes, someone's dog, someone's satellite dish, and the crowd nodded, comforted by the well-rehearsed rhythm. Then, without flourish, a man in plain clothes rose near the front and politely asked the moderator if the meeting could be paused for a brief presentation from visiting members. A dozen older residents murmured approval. Deborah's smile flickered once, just long enough for the cameras to pick up, and then she recovered. She'd rehearsed every contingency except this quiet one. The projection screen clicked on. The room darkened. At first, it was a simple slide, an image of the HOA's bank ledger, months of maintenance entries, payments routed to vendors that didn't exist, invoices with Deborah's signature smeared across them like a crooked watermark. The murmur grew. Heads turned, Michael didn't stand. He didn't need to. He let the evidence do the talking. The prosecutor's voice, calm and measured, filled the canopy of the community tent. We have audited records indicating the redirection of HOA funds to personal accounts. Here are the transaction IDs. Numbers, dates, signatures, plain truths laid out like bones. Deborah's composure cracked at the edges. She leaned forward as if to snatch the microphone, then thought better of it. On the next slide, the room saw more. Video clips from neighborhood cameras. Deborah's car at odd hours near a vacant lot. Her meeting with contractors who later billed the HOA for unused labor, and an audio recording where she was heard threatening to teach certain families a lesson about conformity. The crowd shifted. The applause that had buoyed her earlier dissolved into whispers, sharp and immediate. The man who'd requested the presentation stepped down and, with the same quiet authority I'd learned to trust in Michael, introduced the lead investigator. She was from the Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Office. Her badge glinted in the dim light. One by one, people in the room were shown the truth of their own neighborhood. It landed like cold rain, the fines that had been levied against elderly homeowners for minor paint shades, the safety fees the board had billed to residents who dared to complain, the secret blacklist of those Deborah derided as problem families. Each revelation was less spectacle and more ledger, unsentimental, precise, devastating. Deborah tried to stand, tried to retake the narrative, but the sound of her voice was drowned by her own words, which now looped across the screen with timestamps and signatures. Her methods had been meticulous. Her undoing would be too. At the back of the tent, a deputy quietly read the charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, coercion, willful discrimination. That was when the cameras stopped being politely interested and became witnesses. The people watching on live feed were not neighbors. They were citizens seeing how a petty tyrant had built cruelty into bylaws. Deborah's face finally reflected something other than smug control: fear. And beyond fear was the dawning comprehension that the presidency she'd treated like a crown was little more than a paper throne. The law, which she had mocked with petty citations, had arrived not with a shout but with an inventory, receipts, timestamps, testimony. As investigators politely escorted her from the podium, neighbors looked at one another with the blank, furrowed faces of people who'd been betrayed. Sophie's small hand tightened around mine. I felt her tiny heartbeat under my palm, fierce and steady. Michael leaned down, whispering, "We do this by the book," and the book, by which I mean law, evidence, and patience, was doing its patient surgical work. The reversal wasn't violent. It had to be cleaner than vengeance, because the stakes were the soul of a neighborhood. The trap we'd set was factual, airtight, and mercilessly fair. That is how you take down a ruler who believed she was above rule. When Deborah was led away, the applause that rose was not triumphal. It was the sound of a community beginning to breathe again. We didn't shout. We didn't gloat. We simply closed ranks around the people she had tried to erase. Families, the elderly, the children who could be children again. That night, the news ran a quiet line: local HOA president arrested in federal probe. It was a measured headline for a measured operation. But measured doesn't mean small. Measured means permanent. The arraignment was scheduled with the efficiency of men who understood the cost of delay. Courtrooms are places where language becomes law, where nuance hardens into verdicts. For Deborah, it was both stage and spotlight, but this time she'd no audience of sycophants, only jurors, judges, clerks, and the people who had been harmed. We sat in the fourth row, Sophie at my side. Her brace-scarred knees peeked out from behind her dress, a small, fierce constellation of healing. I watched her more than the proceedings at first. Watching her was my anchor. Around us, neighbors whispered into hands, turning over what they'd seen, what they'd lost, and not least, how they might rebuild. The prosecution laid out the ledger like a map of wrongdoing. Each line item was connected to an email, each email to a voice memo, each voice memo to a witness who had once feared Deborah's gaze. A retired accountant testified about irregularities that would make any auditor's jaw drop. A local contractor admitted to padding invoices under pressure. A former board member, Richard, whose letter had first made me suspect there was more, gave a deliberate, painful testimony of threats, coerced votes, and a list of targeted families. Then the moment everyone had been waiting for, the playback of Deborah's recorded remarks, in her own voice, threatening and casual. "They'll learn to do what I say," she'd said in one clip. In another, "If you want to live here, you'll obey." The words hung in the air of the courtroom like a verdict before the jury began. The defense tried the usual things: humanize the accused, suggest error, argue stress and misinterpretation. But the pattern was too wide now. It couldn't be smoothed into a single poor choice. The jury listened to the sequence, to the accumulation of evidence, the ripped braces in our driveway, the informal polls she'd used to justify fines, the diverted funds. When I took the stand, not to plead, but to state the facts, I did so with the same calm each mother learns when a child is hurt. I spoke of Sophie's braces as necessary tools, of the nights we'd spent practicing steps until toes ached, of the pride in every small victory. I described the ripping, the sound it made, the way Sophie's breath had come out of her in a single ragged inhalation. I did not yell. I described. I did not plead. I documented. My words were not just for the jury. They were for neighbors who had watched someone's humanity be leached away by bylaw. They were for Sophie, so she would know her mother's voice had not flinched. When cross-examination came, Deborah's lawyer tried to make me small, suggesting anger, implying motive. I answered each question with plain fact. That's what broke through the fog. Detail, sequence, evidence. The court is a machine that runs on specifics, and the specifics belong to us. The jury deliberated with the weight of what they'd heard. When the verdict read back, guilty on charges of assault, battery, coercion, and several counts of civil rights violations, the sound that left me was less jubilation than release. Justice, when it's patient and exact, smells faintly of closure. The sentence was made to resonate with the harm done. The judge, a careful man, outlined restitution, community service, and a prohibition on holding any HOA role for life. Deborah would repay, repair, and be restricted from wielding community power again. The law, in its measure, echoed our sense that punishment should not only reckon, but restore. Outside the courthouse, cameras swiveled toward neighborhoods that suddenly had a story to tell. Not simple scandal, but a study in how small tyrannies metastasize and how law, properly used, can excise them. Michael hugged Sophie close. Neighbors came up one by one, murmuring apologies, offers of help, cups of coffee, a million small hands extended. It was quiet, not brash. That's how real repair begins. Judgment Day did not end our work. It began a different kind. Deborah's penalties included not only restitution payments and a ban from leadership, but an order that would sting in a way only she would understand. She was to oversee, for a full year, the restoration of every home and public space she had judged and fined under supervision. She would scrub playground benches, repaint mailboxes that had been unjustly flagged for poor aesthetic, and assist families in repairing the damage her edicts had caused. It was, the judge noted, both practical restitution and symbolic restoration. She showed up in an orange vest the first week, all stiff apologies and hesitant motions. The public was allowed to observe. Cameras were allowed to film. It was not meant to be humiliation theater. It was meant to be accountability with muscle. The work was physical, slow, sanding, painting, fixing. Each brush stroke required a different humility than the proclamations that once filled auditoriums. Sophie watched from the grass, a small supervisor with stickers and a purple water bottle. She learned to nod and say thank you in a way that was entirely Sophie, generous and brave. One afternoon, when Deborah paused and looked at the tiny scar on Sophie's shin, something like regret crossed her face. "I didn't understand," she said simply, and the words were not performance. They were the beginning of comprehension. The HOA itself was overhauled. Federal oversight meant new bylaws, transparency protocols, independent audits, and an ombudsman position to prevent future concentrations of power. Neighbors formed committees to support each other. A kindness fund was created, seeded with Deborah's restitution payments to defray medical costs for families who'd been fined into poverty. The irony of that last part was not lost on anyone. For Sophie, the visible restoration was small but profound. New, custom-fitted braces, lighter, painted with tiny stars and planets, and a redesigned ramp at the playground with gentle rails at just the right height. Michael supervised the procurement quietly, insisting the braces be a celebration rather than an afterthought. On the day Sophie tried them on, she declared herself a rocket and sprinted down the ramp, laughter ricocheting off the slide. I felt something shift in me, like the unpeeling of an old wound into a scar that finally itched in the right way. People apologize in different tongues. Some give money. Some give time. Some offer their hands. Maplewood began to do all three. Neighbors who'd once turned away now came by with casseroles. Small apologies arrived as action. When the town council published new standards, they emphasized inclusion, disability access, and the human dignity of residents, language that had once been absent from Deborah's rule book. One evening, we walked past the playground as the sun set and found Deborah on a ladder, stringing lights over the swings. She looked unexpectedly fragile in the dusk, but the lights made the playground look like a small, safe galaxy. Sophie waved. Deborah looked up, nodded, and returned to her task without fanfare. Poetic justice is not always theatrical. Sometimes it's slow. Materials sweat, policy changes, a child's laugh returning to a place that once tried to silence it. That was our justice, restorative and intentional. It cost Deborah her office and her pride, but it gave us back the thing she'd tried to privatize: community. Months later, I still find myself tracing the pattern of small miracles. Sophie's scar is a pale ribbon now. Her braces are playful and proud, and our front yard hosts more laughter than letters from legal counsel. The rhythm of our days regained that old gentle pace. Playgrounds, school recitals, the quiet neighborly knocks of borrowed sugar and returned cups. Michael and I talk about the weeks when everything felt like a trial, both the legal ones and the ones of holding our daughter through outrage. We don't pretend trauma disappears. We say it into the light and keep walking. His work did not end with Deborah's arrest. He sat on panels about HOA oversight, wrote memos that led to policy changes, and testified before delegations that wanted to prevent another Langford. He did it not for glory, but because he understood how systems fail people when left unchecked. The lesson that stayed with me was simple and stubborn. Institutions are only as humane as the people who run them. When people confuse authority with belonging, cruelty blooms. When rules are written without empathy, they become instruments of harm. We learn to read bylaws not as absolutes, but as frameworks that must be tempered by compassion. Sophie became a small ambassador of that compassion. Teachers invited her to speak at assemblies. She described her braces as my super legs and told curious kids that bravery is getting up and trying again. She never became bitter. She became insistently kind, perhaps because she saw from an early age how goodness could rebuild what brutality tried to break. Sometimes people ask me if I ever wanted revenge. I tell them no, not in the way people imagine revenge. What I wanted was accountability that left us free to be ourselves again. And in that I found a strange contentment. The law, properly used, is more elegant than vengeance. It restores the steps we've lost. When we pass the playground now, I sometimes reach down and smooth Sophie's hair, watching her set off toward the slide with the kind of confidence that comes from being loved and protected. That is the sound of justice to me, the soft stomp of small feet on firm ground. If someone tore away what your child needs to walk, what would you do? Would you roar back, or would you build a case that chips away at injustice until it cannot stand? Tell me below. Your story, your choice. If this moved you, subscribe for more stories of quiet courage, surgical justice, and the small moments that rebuild communities. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stay calm. Gather the facts and let truth walk through the neighborhood like sunlight. Slow. steady and impossible to ignore.